On the morning of June 15, 1944, air raid sirens wailed across Kyushu for the first time in the war. Japanese citizens looked up in confusion and disbelief as massive silver aircraft, larger than anything they had ever seen, emerged from the clouds at 25,000 feet. These were Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, and they had flown nearly 1,500 miles from bases deep in China to strike at the heart of Japanese industry. The Yawata Steel Works, one of the empire's most vital production facilities, was about to be bombed. Japan's military leaders had assured the population that the homeland was safe, that no enemy bomber could possibly reach them. In that moment, as the first bombs began to fall, that promise shattered like glass. What these civilians didn't know was that this was only the beginning, that the silver giants overhead would return again and again, that their cities would burn, and that the weapon designed specifically to bring Japan to its knees had finally arrived at their doorstep. The question wasn't if more would come, but how soon, and whether anything could stop them. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of how American bombers reached the Japanese mainland from China begins years before that first raid, in the minds of aircraft designers who understood that defeating Japan would require a weapon unlike any that had come before. The vast Pacific Ocean presented challenges that no previous war had encountered. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of water, and by 1942, its industrial heartland remained comfortably beyond the range of any Allied bomber. The Japanese military counted on this geographic advantage. Their planners believed that even if America won battles in the distant Pacific, the homeland itself would remain untouched, allowing continuous production of war materials, training of new forces, and maintenance of civilian morale. Boeing Aircraft Company had begun developing long-range bomber concepts in the late 1930s, but it wasn't until 1940 that the United States Army Air Forces issued a formal requirement for a hemispheric defense weapon, an aircraft that could fly from American bases to targets anywhere and return. The specifications seemed almost impossible. The bomber needed to carry a bomb load of at least 2,000 pounds over a distance of 5,300 miles at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, all while operating at altitudes that would put it beyond the reach of most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. When war came to America in December 1941, these requirements became urgently necessary, not just for defense, but for offensive strikes against Japan. Boeing's Model 345, which would become the B-29 Superfortress, represented the most technologically advanced aircraft ever attempted. Its design pushed every boundary of contemporary aviation. The fuselage was enormous, nearly 100 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, were needed to lift the aircraft and its potential load of 74,000 pounds. To achieve the necessary speed and altitude, Boeing engineers designed a wing with a high aspect ratio and sophisticated high-lift devices. The aircraft featured a pressurized cabin, allowing the crew to operate at extreme altitudes without bulky oxygen equipment for extended periods. Remote-controlled gun turrets, directed by computerized fire control systems, provided defensive armament. The bomb bay could carry up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance in various configurations. Development proved extraordinarily difficult and costly. The first prototype flew on September 21, 1942, but disaster struck less than a month later when the second prototype crashed after an engine fire, killing Boeing's chief test pilot and 10 others. The engines proved temperamental, prone to overheating and catching fire. The pressurization system leaked. The remote gun turrets malfunctioned. The fire control computer, an analog mechanical marvel of its time, required constant adjustment. Despite these problems, the Army Air Forces needed the B-29 so desperately that they ordered it into production before testing was complete. An almost unprecedented decision that would cost nearly $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that would develop the atomic bomb. While Boeing struggled to make the B-29 operational, Allied strategists debated how to use it against Japan. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific was making slow progress. Capturing islands close enough to Japan to serve as bomber bases would take years. However, China presented an alternative. The nationalist Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, controlled portions of inland China beyond the reach of Japanese ground forces. If bases could be established in the Chengdu region of Sichuan province, B-29s might be able to strike targets in Manchuria, Korea, and even the Japanese home islands. This concept became Operation Matterhorn, perhaps the most logistically challenging air campaign ever attempted. The obstacles were staggering. The Chengdu region had no existing infrastructure suitable for heavy bomber operations. Airfields had to be constructed from nothing in remote areas with no modern equipment. Chinese laborers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, built runways by hand, crushing stones, moving earth with baskets and wheelbarrows, and packing surfaces using stone rollers pulled by workers when no machinery was available. The physical labor required was immense, but the Chinese people committed to the task, understanding that these bases represented a way to strike back at the invaders who had ravaged their country since 1937. Even after the bases were built, supplying them proved nearly impossible. Everything the B-29s needed had to be flown over the Himalaya mountains from India, a route so dangerous that pilots called it flying the hump. Fuel, bombs, spare parts, food, and every other necessity traveled along this aerial supply line where aircraft faced terrible weather, icing conditions, violent turbulence, and peaks reaching over 20,000 feet. Planes went down regularly, vanishing into remote mountain valleys where no rescue was possible. For every gallon of fuel a B-29 used on a combat mission from China, 7 gallons had to be burned transporting supplies over the hump. The mathematics were brutal, but the determination to strike Japan made the effort worthwhile to Allied commanders. The 58th Bombardment Wing, assigned to Operation Matterhorn, began deploying to India in early 1944. The unit's personnel had trained extensively in the United States, learning to operate and maintain the complex B-29s, but nothing prepared them for the conditions they would face in the China-Burma-India theater. The bases in India were primitive, carved from jungle and swamp. Monsoon rains turned everything to mud. Diseases including malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged the crews. Maintenance had to be performed in open-air conditions with limited facilities. The heat and humidity were oppressive, and the B-29's temperamental engines seemed to hate the climate as much as the men did. Despite these challenges, the 58th Bombardment Wing began flying missions in June 1944. The first operational mission came on June 5th, when 98 B-29s took off from Indian bases to attack railroad yards in Bangkok, Thailand. This was a relatively short-range mission designed to test procedures and identify problems before attempting the long flight to Japan. Losses were light, and the mission was judged successful enough to proceed with more ambitious plans. 10 days later, on June 15th, 47 B-29s launched from forward bases around Chengdu to attack the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata on the island of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost home island. The men who flew that first mission to Japan understood the historical significance of what they were attempting. No enemy aircraft had bombed the Japanese homeland since April 1942, when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet in a one-way raid against Tokyo and other cities. That raid had been a propaganda triumph, but strategically insignificant, with the aircraft carrying small bomb loads and incapable of returning to any friendly base. Many of Doolittle's crews were killed or captured after running out of fuel over China. The June 15th mission would be different. These were 4-engine heavy bombers carrying substantial bomb loads, operating from established bases and capable of striking Japan repeatedly in a sustained campaign. The flight to Yawata required meticulous planning. The B-29s would fly nearly 1,600 miles over water and enemy-held territory, much of the journey in darkness. Navigation had to be precise, as straying off course could mean running out of fuel over the ocean or stumbling into areas with heavy Japanese fighter concentrations. Weather forecasting was primitive, and crews had to be prepared for unexpected conditions. Each aircraft carried a crew of 11 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, and 4 gunners. Every man had trained for months to reach this moment, but training and reality were always different. As the B-29s approached Kyushu that night, Japanese radar operators detected the incoming formation. Air raid sirens began wailing across the island, the first time most residents had ever heard them used in earnest. Civilians rushed to shelters or simply stared at the sky in confusion. The Japanese military had assured them repeatedly that the homeland was invulnerable, that American bombers could never reach Japan. The sound of the sirens meant that promise had been broken. Fighter aircraft scrambled from airfields around Kyushu, but climbing to intercept bombers at 25,000 feet took time, and the B-29s were already beginning their bomb runs. The Yawata steelworks sprawled across a large area, its blast furnaces, rolling mills, and support facilities producing armor plate and other vital war materials. Bombing accurately at night from extreme altitude was extraordinarily difficult with the technology of 1944. The Norden bomb site, which had promised precision, proved far less accurate in combat than in testing. Clouds, darkness, wind, and enemy action all degraded accuracy. Of the 47 B-29s that launched from China, only 1 was lost to enemy action, but many others aborted due to mechanical problems or failed to locate the target. Those that did drop bombs scattered them across a wide area. Physical damage to the steelworks was minimal, with production barely affected. By purely material measures, the raid was nearly a failure. Yet the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Japanese civilians understood that the war they had been told was going well, that their military was winning, had come home. American bombers had flown more than 1,500 miles to strike at Japan's industrial heart. If they could do it once, they could do it again. The myth of invulnerability was shattered. Japanese leaders scrambled to explain how this had happened. They increased fighter patrols and anti-aircraft defenses, but they knew the fundamental problem. Japan lacked the technological capability to reliably intercept bombers operating at the altitudes and speeds the B-29 achieved. The Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service had produced excellent fighters for the early war years. The Mitsubishi A6M0 in particular had been a formidable opponent in 1941 and 1942, outmaneuvering American fighters and achieving air superiority across the Pacific. However, Japanese aircraft design had not kept pace with American development. By 1944, newer American fighters like the P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang outperformed Japanese aircraft in most respects. More critically, Japanese fighters struggled to reach the altitudes where B-29s operated. The Zero, optimized for maneuverability at low to medium altitudes, performed poorly above 20,000 feet. Its engine lacked power, its controls became mushy in the thin air, and its light armament, designed for dogfighting with other fighters, was inadequate against the B-29's heavy construction and defensive armament. Japan attempted to develop high-altitude interceptors, but the war's demands and limited resources meant that few reached operational status in significant numbers. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu and Nakajima J-1N Gecko were twin-engine fighters with better altitude performance, but they were relatively slow and couldn't catch a B-29 that didn't want to fight. Some Japanese fighters were modified with additional firepower, including large-caliber cannons and even aerial bombs or rockets meant to be dropped into bomber formations. Pilots attempted ramming attacks, deliberately crashing their aircraft into B-29s, sacrificing themselves to destroy the enemy bomber. These desperate tactics occasionally succeeded, but could never stop a determined bombing campaign. Anti-aircraft artillery presented another challenge for Japan. Effective anti-aircraft fire required accurate range-finding, precise timing, and weapons capable of reaching the target altitude. Japanese flak guns, while numerous around important targets, were generally of smaller caliber than their German counterparts and had difficulty reaching 25,000 feet or higher. The fire control systems were less advanced, making accurate prediction of a bomber's future position difficult. Searchlights could help direct fire at night, but the B-29's high altitude often put it above effective searchlight range. Japanese gunners fired tremendous amounts of ammunition at incoming B-29s, filling the sky with black bursts of flak, but the hit rate was low. B-29s often returned to base with flak damage, but relatively few were brought down by anti-aircraft fire alone. After the Yawata raid, the 58th Bombardment Wing continued operations from China through the summer and fall of 1944, though the pace was limited by the logistical nightmare of supplying the bases. Each mission required weeks of preparation, flying tons of fuel and bombs over the hump from India. The wing attacked various targets in Manchuria, Kyushu, and other areas within range. Steelworks, aircraft factories, port facilities, and other industrial targets were struck with varying degrees of success. The missions provided valuable experience in B-29 operations and proved that Japan could be reached. But Operation Matterhorn would never become the sustained bombing campaign that Allied strategists envisioned. The fundamental problem was simply too much effort for too little result. The supply line over the Himalayas consumed vast resources that might have been used elsewhere. The Chinese bases were vulnerable to Japanese ground offensives, and by late 1944, Japanese forces were advancing toward the Chengdu region, threatening the airfields. Meanwhile, American forces were making faster progress across the Pacific than anyone had expected. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping campaign had seized key islands in the Marianas chain by summer of 1944. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were captured in bloody fighting, but their strategic value was immense. These islands were only about 1,400 miles from Tokyo, well within the B-29's range, and they offered something China could never provide, a secure base area with port facilities allowing unlimited supplies to be delivered by ship rather than by air. In October 1944, the decision was made to shift the primary B-29 effort from China to the Marianas. The 58th Bombardment Wing would continue operations from China for a few more months before being redeployed, but the main weight of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan would come from the XXI Bomber Command, which began building up on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands offered multiple advantages. They were closer to Japan than the Chinese bases, reducing flight time and increasing bomb loads. Supply by sea was vastly more efficient than supply by air. The bases were secure from Japanese ground attack and could be developed with permanent facilities, maintenance shops, fuel storage, and all the infrastructure needed for sustained operations. Most importantly, there was no limit to the number of B-29s that could be based there. The transformation of the Marianas into a massive bomber base complex happened with remarkable speed. Navy Seabees and Army engineers carved airfields from jungle and coral, built taxiways and hard stands, erected maintenance facilities and barracks. Thousands of tons of construction materials arrived by ship. The island of Tinian, in particular, became a marvel of military logistics. Engineers built North Field, which had 4 parallel runways, each over 8,000 feet long, capable of handling hundreds of heavy bombers. At its peak, Tinian would host more takeoffs and landings than any airport in the world, busier than New York or Chicago, all in support of the campaign against Japan. Brigadier General Haywood Hansel commanded XXI Bomber Command during the initial buildup on the Marianas. Hansel was an advocate of precision daylight bombing, the doctrine that had guided the American bomber offensive against Germany. He believed that careful selection of key industrial targets and accurate bombing would cripple Japan's war-making capacity without the need for area attacks against cities. Under his command, the first B-29 mission from the Marianas launched on November 24, 1944. The target was the Musashino aircraft plant near Tokyo, which produced engines for Japanese fighters. 111 B-29s participated, the largest force yet assembled against a single target in the Pacific. The results were disappointing. Weather over Japan was worse than anticipated, with heavy clouds obscuring the target. The jet stream, a high-altitude wind phenomenon that was not yet well understood, scattered the bomber formations and threw off bombing calculations. Some aircraft encountered winds of over 200 miles per hour at altitude, making accurate bombing nearly impossible. Of the bombs that were dropped, only a small fraction hit anywhere near the target. The Musashino plant continued operations with minimal disruption. Worse, Japanese fighters, now operating from bases around Tokyo, attacked the formation aggressively. Several B-29s were damaged, and losses began to mount in subsequent missions. Over the following weeks, Hansel's command flew more missions against targets around Tokyo and other Japanese cities, but the results remained poor. Weather, the jet stream, and Japanese defenses all contributed to low bombing accuracy and limited damage. The B-29, for all its technological sophistication, was not achieving the results that its enormous cost and the sacrifices of its crews deserved. The aircraft had been designed to operate at high altitudes, where it would be safe from most defenses, but at those altitudes, the very factors that provided safety also made accurate bombing nearly impossible with the available technology. Something had to change. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay arrived to take command of Bomber Command, replacing Hansel. LeMay had built a reputation as a hard-driving, results-oriented commander during the bomber offensive against Germany. He had pioneered new tactical formations and bombing techniques that improved accuracy and reduced losses. He was known for leading missions himself, sharing the dangers faced by his crews. He was also willing to question established doctrine if it wasn't producing results. When he examined the operations from the Marianas, he saw massive resources being expended for minimal effect. The precision bombing campaign wasn't working, and LeMay began considering alternatives. Japanese cities, unlike their European counterparts, were largely constructed of wood and paper. Traditional Japanese architecture used timber frames with paper screens and wooden walls. Even in modern cities, large sections were composed of these traditional structures, densely packed together with narrow streets between them. This construction made Japanese cities extraordinarily vulnerable to fire, but it also presented an opportunity. If precision attacks against specific factories weren't working, perhaps area attacks using incendiary bombs could destroy the industrial capacity of entire cities by burning them down. It was a radical departure from American bombing doctrine, and it would inevitably kill large numbers of civilians, but LeMay concluded it was the most effective way to end the war quickly. LeMay began planning a series of experimental missions to test the effectiveness of incendiary attacks. He made another controversial decision. The B-29s would attack at night from low altitude, around 5,000 to 7,000 feet, rather than 25,000 feet. This seemed incredibly dangerous, putting the bombers within range of light anti-aircraft guns and making them vulnerable to fighters. However, LeMay's analysis suggested that Japanese night fighter capability was limited and that low-altitude attacks would avoid the jet stream, allow heavier bomb loads by burning less fuel on climb to altitude, and make navigation and targeting easier. To maximize bomb loads, he ordered most defensive armament removed from the B-29s except for the tail guns. It was a calculated risk that horrified many of his subordinates, but LeMay believed the rewards justified the danger. The first low-level incendiary mission was flown on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, against Tokyo. The target was a densely populated area of residential and small industrial buildings in the eastern part of the city. 334 B-29s participated, carrying a mix of incendiary bombs designed to spread fire rapidly. The M69 incendiary bomb, which would become the primary weapon, was a 6-pound cluster weapon filled with napalm gel that burst on impact, spreading burning petroleum jelly that stuck to everything it touched. Each B-29 carried thousands of pounds of these weapons. The attack began shortly after midnight. Lead aircraft marked the target area with incendiaries, creating a glowing X visible to following bombers. The weather was ideal, with clear skies and strong winds that would fan any flames. As the bombs began to fall, fires started across the target area, quickly merging into larger conflagrations. The wooden buildings burned like kindling. Fire spread from structure to structure with terrifying speed. Soon, individual fires were combining into a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where the heat of the fire creates its own wind system, sucking in air from all sides and sending temperatures soaring to over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The people of Tokyo's eastern districts tried to flee, but the fire moved faster than they could run. Streets became channels of flame. Canals and rivers offered no safety as the water heated until it boiled. Air raid shelters, often nothing more than shallow dugouts, became ovens. The fire consumed oxygen, suffocating those who huddled in basements or shelters. By morning, when the flames finally burned themselves out, over 15 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed. The exact death toll has never been determined with certainty, but estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 people killed in a single night, making it the deadliest bombing raid in history, more lethal than either of the atomic bomb attacks that would follow months later. The B-29 crews reported that the smell of burning flesh reached them at altitude, a sickening, sweet odor that penetrated even the pressurized cabins. Some men vomited at the realization of what they had done. The turbulence from the fire tossed the heavy bombers around like toys. The heat was so intense that some aircraft had their paint scorched and their plexiglass nose sections cracked. 14 B-29s were lost, a higher number than on high-altitude missions, but still only 4% of the attacking force, an acceptable loss rate by the standards of strategic bombing. More importantly, the mission had destroyed a significant portion of Tokyo's industrial capacity in a single night. Small workshops and cottage industries that produced parts and materials for Japanese war production were simply gone, vaporized along with the neighborhoods that housed them. LeMay and his staff analyzed the results and concluded that the low-altitude incendiary attacks were far more effective than high-altitude precision bombing had been. The decision was made to continue and expand the campaign. Over the next months, every major Japanese city would experience similar attacks. On March 11th to 12th, Nagoya was firebombed. March 13th to 14th saw Osaka attacked. Kobe followed on March 16th to 17th. Each raid destroyed several square miles of urban area and killed thousands of people. The B-29s came at night, in formations of hundreds, dropping tens of thousands of incendiary bombs. Japanese defenses were overwhelmed. Fighters tried to intercept, occasionally shooting down a bomber, but they couldn't stop the formations. Anti-aircraft fire was largely ineffective. Japan had no answer to the onslaught. By April 1945, with the major cities burning, the campaign expanded to smaller cities that had previously been considered secondary targets. Koriyama, Tsu, Yokkaichi, and dozens of other towns experienced raids. The pattern was always the same. Sirens would wail, aircraft would appear overhead, bombs would fall, and fire would consume the city. Japanese authorities tried to prepare, organizing firefighting brigades, evacuating civilians, creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings. But nothing worked against the scale of attack the B-29s delivered. The sheer volume of incendiaries overwhelmed any defensive measures. Buildings that had been cleared to create fire breaks were bypassed as the fire jumped across streets and open spaces, driven by its own generated winds. The destruction of Japan's cities had profound effects beyond the immediate physical damage. The Japanese economy, never as industrialized as that of the United States or even Germany, depended heavily on small-scale production. Individual workshops and family-run businesses produced components that were assembled in larger factories. When the residential areas burned, this network of subcontractors was destroyed. Large factories might survive a raid, but without the parts and materials they needed from smaller suppliers, they couldn't maintain production. Transportation networks were disrupted as rail yards and bridges became targets. The civilian population, already suffering from shortages of food and consumer goods, faced homelessness and starvation as their neighborhoods were destroyed. Civilian morale, which the Japanese government had worked hard to maintain through propaganda and strict information control, began to crack. People who had been told that Japan was winning the war could see that American bombers were flying overhead with apparent impunity, burning cities with no effective opposition. The loss of faith in the military's ability to protect them was perhaps as important as the physical destruction. Japanese civilians began to question what they were told, to doubt the official narratives, and to despair of ever achieving victory. This psychological defeat was as critical as any military defeat on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the war continued on other fronts. American forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945, bringing ground combat within a few hundred miles of the Japanese mainland for the first time. The battle for Okinawa was savage, with Japanese forces fighting with suicidal determination and American forces facing kamikaze attacks from aircraft and boats loaded with explosives. The high casualties on both sides reinforced American determination to avoid invading the Japanese home islands if any alternative existed. The B-29 campaign was part of that alternative, an attempt to force Japan to surrender by destroying its ability to wage war without the need for a ground invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. In May 1945, with Germany's surrender ending the war in Europe, the full resources of the United States could be redirected toward the Pacific. More B-29s arrived in the Marianas. The XXI Bomber Command grew to over 1,000 aircraft. Missions that had once involved hundreds of bombers now involved 500 or more. The scale of destruction increased proportionally. On May 23rd to 24th, another massive raid on Tokyo burned out an additional 16 square miles of the city. Japan's capital was being systematically erased from existence, block by block, district by district. By July 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been attacked by B-29s using incendiaries. The total area destroyed exceeded 175 square miles. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 300,000 civilians, with millions more homeless. Japan's industrial production had fallen by more than 50% from its peak. The civilian economy was in collapse, with severe shortages of food, fuel, clothing, and every other necessity. The government had evacuated millions of people from cities to rural areas, disrupting production further. Transportation systems were in chaos. The merchant marine, which Japan needed to transport raw materials and food, had been devastated by American submarines and aircraft. The nation was being strangled, burned, and starved simultaneously. Yet the Japanese government refused to surrender. Military leaders, particularly in the army, remained committed to fighting to the end. They spoke of the decisive battle for the homeland, where Japanese spirit and determination would overcome American material superiority. They planned to mobilize the entire population, arming civilians with bamboo spears if necessary, to resist an invasion. The concept of national suicide, of fighting until every Japanese citizen was dead rather than accepting defeat, was seriously discussed. The government hoped that by inflicting massive casualties on American invasion forces, they might negotiate a settlement that would preserve some form of the imperial system and avoid unconditional surrender. American planners, knowing these attitudes existed, prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. The operation would begin with the invasion of Kyushu in November 1945, followed by Coronet, the invasion of the main island of Honshu in 1946. Casualty estimates were horrifying. Based on the experience at Okinawa and the expected resistance, planners projected hundreds of thousands of American casualties, with Japanese military and civilian deaths in the millions. The United States even began manufacturing hundreds of thousands of Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the wounded from the invasion. The medals manufactured for the invasion of Japan are still being issued today, more than 80 years later, because so many were made. In this context, the atomic bomb program took on desperate urgency. The Manhattan Project had been working since 1942 to develop nuclear weapons, and by July 1945, the first bombs were ready for use. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan remains controversial, but to the leaders making the decision in the summer of 1945, it seemed like the best hope of ending the war quickly without an invasion. A single bomb that could destroy an entire city in an instant might finally shock Japan into surrender where months of conventional bombing had failed. The first atomic bomb was tested successfully in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. 3 weeks later, on August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian carrying a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The target was Hiroshima, a city that had been deliberately left mostly untouched by conventional bombing to serve as a test case for the atomic weapon. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb detonated at an altitude of 1,960 feet above the city. The explosion released energy equivalent to about 16 kilotons of TNT. The temperature at ground zero reached several thousand degrees. Everything within a radius of about 1 mile was vaporized or incinerated. The blast wave destroyed buildings for miles in every direction. Fires started across the city. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the following weeks and months from radiation sickness and injuries. The Japanese government initially struggled to understand what had happened. Communications with Hiroshima were disrupted, and early reports were confused. When investigators reached the city and saw the unprecedented scale of destruction, they realized something new had been used. President Harry Truman issued a statement explaining that an atomic bomb had been dropped and warning that if Japan did not surrender, it would face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The Japanese military leadership debated how to respond. Some argued for surrender, others for continuing the fight. While they debated, American forces prepared to use the second bomb. On August 9th, another B-29, boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, took off from Tinian carrying a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target was the city of Kokura, but cloud cover over that city forced the bomber to divert to its secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 in the morning, the second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki with an explosive force of about 21 kilotons. The city's terrain channeled the blast, limiting damage somewhat compared to Hiroshima, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Between 35,000 and 40,000 people died immediately, with thousands more dying later. The city's industrial areas, including the Mitsubishi shipyards and armaments plants, were destroyed. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, opening a new front and eliminating any hope Japan had of using Soviet mediation to negotiate an end to the war. Faced with atomic bombs, Soviet invasion, and the ongoing conventional bombing campaign, Emperor Hirohito made the unprecedented decision to intervene in the military's deliberations. On August 15, 1945, he recorded a radio address announcing Japan's acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, effectively surrendering. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. The war was over. The B-29 Superfortress had accomplished its mission. From the first tentative raids from China in June 1944 to the atomic bomb missions of August 1945, the Silver Giants had demonstrated that no target in Japan was safe, that the homeland was vulnerable, that the war could be brought to Japanese civilians as surely as it had been brought to people across Asia and the Pacific by Japanese forces. The aircraft that Japan believed could never reach them had not only reached them, but had systematically destroyed their cities and broken their will to continue fighting. The cost had been enormous. Over 3,000 B-29s were built during the war, and hundreds were lost in combat or accidents. Thousands of crewmen died flying missions over Japan and China. On the ground, the human cost was measured in hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians killed, millions left homeless, and entire cities reduced to ash and rubble. The ethical questions raised by the strategic bombing campaign, particularly the firebombing of cities and the use of atomic weapons, continue to be debated by historians, ethicists, and military professionals. Were these actions justified by the need to end the war quickly and avoid an invasion? Could Japan have been defeated by less destructive means? There are no easy answers to these questions. What is clear is that the B-29 Superfortress changed the nature of warfare. It demonstrated that distance and geography could no longer protect nations from attack. It showed that strategic bombing could destroy a nation's ability to wage war by targeting its industrial base and civilian morale. It proved that technological superiority could compensate for numerical disadvantages. The lessons learned from the B-29 campaign influenced military thinking for decades. The concept of strategic bombing, refined and developed during World War II, shaped Cold War strategy and continues to influence military doctrine today. The crews who flew the B-29 missions faced dangers that are hard to imagine today. Every mission was a test of endurance, skill, and courage. Flights lasted 12 to 15 hours or more, much of it over water or enemy territory with no hope of rescue if something went wrong. The B-29's engines, never fully reliable, could fail at any time. Fuel was always a concern, calculated precisely with little margin for error. Weather could change unexpectedly, turning a difficult mission into a desperate fight for survival. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire meant that every mission could be your last. The psychological strain was immense, knowing that you were burning cities and killing civilians, even if you believed it was necessary to win the war. Yet these men continued to fly. They believed in their mission, trusted their training, relied on their crewmates, and did their duty as they understood it. Many struggled with what they had done after the war ended. Some had nightmares about the fires they had started and the people who died in them. Others defended the campaign as necessary and justified, pointing to the lives saved by avoiding an invasion. Most simply tried to return to normal life, to put the war behind them and move forward, though the memories never entirely faded. The B-29 itself continued in service for years after the war ended. During the Korean War, B-29s flew bombing missions against North Korean targets, though by then they were vulnerable to jet fighters and increasingly obsolete. The last combat mission by a B-29 was flown in 1954. Many were converted to other purposes, serving as tankers, reconnaissance platforms, and test aircraft for new technologies. A few were preserved in museums, where visitors today can see the aircraft that changed history and try to imagine what it was like to fly these machines into combat. The impact of the B-29 campaign on Japan extended far beyond the immediate physical destruction. The psychological trauma of the bombing affected an entire generation of Japanese people. Survivors of the firebombing raids and atomic attacks carried their memories and injuries for the rest of their lives. The rebuilding of Japanese cities required decades of effort. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless other cities had to be reconstructed almost from scratch. In some ways, this destruction allowed Japan to modernize more rapidly than might otherwise have been possible, building contemporary cities on the ruins of the old. But the human cost of that transformation was staggering. The bombing campaign also influenced Japanese military thinking in profound ways. The experience of being unable to defend their homeland against aerial attack shaped post-war Japanese strategic culture. The Japanese self-defense forces, established after the war, placed great emphasis on air defense capabilities. The memory of B-29s overhead, unstoppable and destructive, became part of the national consciousness, a reminder of vulnerability that influenced policy decisions for generations. For the United States, the B-29 campaign validated the concept of strategic air power that advocates like Billy Mitchell and Julio Duhay had championed for decades. The Army Air Forces used the success of the B-29 to argue for independence from the Army, an argument that succeeded in 1947 with the creation of the United States Air Force as a separate service. Strategic bombing became a cornerstone of American military strategy, with enormous resources devoted to building bomber fleets, developing nuclear weapons, and planning for potential conflicts with the Soviet Union. The technological legacy of the B-29 was equally significant. Many of the innovations developed for the Superfortress became standard features on subsequent aircraft. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled defensive armament, advanced fire control systems, and high-altitude performance capabilities all evolved from the B-29 program. The Boeing Stratocruiser airliner, which revolutionized commercial air travel in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was directly derived from the B-29 design. The lessons learned in manufacturing the B-29, including the use of distributed production across multiple factories and the development of quality control systems to ensure that parts from different manufacturers were interchangeable, influenced American industrial practice for decades. The strategic bombing campaign also raised questions about the laws of war and the protection of civilians that continue to resonate today. The Geneva Conventions, updated after World War II, attempted to establish clearer rules about the treatment of civilians in wartime. The principle of distinction, which requires combatants to distinguish between military and civilian targets, and the principle of proportionality, which requires that military action not cause excessive civilian harm relative to the military advantage gained, were partly responses to the experiences of World War II, including the strategic bombing campaigns in Europe and Asia. Yet applying these principles has proven difficult in practice. Modern conflicts continue to grapple with questions about what constitutes a legitimate military target when civilian and military functions are intermingled, about how to balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns, and about the responsibility of nations and individuals for the consequences of their actions in war. The B-29 campaign over Japan provides a historical case study that illuminates these dilemmas without necessarily resolving them. The men who planned and executed the B-29 campaign believed they were shortening the war and saving lives, both American and Japanese, by making an invasion unnecessary. The numbers seem to support this view. Casualty estimates for an invasion of Japan ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially in the tens of millions. The actual death toll from the bombing campaign, horrific as it was far lower. From this perspective, the campaign was justified by its results, an application of utilitarian ethics that calculates the moral worth of an action by its consequences. Critics argue that this calculation is flawed, that it justifies atrocities by pointing to hypothetical alternatives that might never have occurred. They note that Japan was already defeated by the summer of 1945, its navy destroyed, its merchant fleet sunk, its cities burning, its people starving. The Soviet entry into the war removed any remaining hope of a negotiated settlement. Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or an invasion, they argue, making the bombing campaign in its final months an unnecessary slaughter. The debate continues among historians, with evidence and arguments on both sides, and no consensus has emerged. What is undeniable is that the B-29 Superfortress changed the world. It demonstrated that technology could overcome geography, that distance no longer provided security, that civilian populations could be targeted deliberately and systematically. It ushered in the atomic age, carrying the bombs that revealed the destructive power of nuclear weapons. It proved that air power could be decisive in war, validating decades of theory and speculation. It influenced the course of the Cold War, as both the United States and the Soviet Union developed strategic bomber fleets and nuclear arsenals. It shaped military strategy, international relations, and strategic thinking for the remainder of the 20th century. The specific story of the B-29 raids from China, the focus of Operation Matterhorn, is often overshadowed by the larger campaign from the Marianas and the atomic bomb missions. Yet those early raids from Chengdu were historically significant. They proved that Japan could be reached, that the homeland was vulnerable, that the myth of invincibility was just that, a myth. The psychological impact on Japanese leaders and civilians of seeing American bombers overhead for the first time cannot be overstated. It was the beginning of the end, the first crack in the edifice of confidence that had sustained Japan's war effort. The logistics of Operation Matterhorn, flying supplies over the Himalaya mountains to support bomber operations from primitive bases in inland China, represented one of the great feats of the war. The thousands of people who made it possible, from the Chinese laborers who built the airfields by hand to the transport pilots who flew the hump to the maintenance crews who kept the B-29s flying under impossible conditions, deserve recognition for their contributions. They worked in obscurity, far from the public attention that focused on combat operations, but without them, the missions would never have been possible. The 58th Bombardment Wing, which flew the missions from China, earned battle honors that are still carried by its successor units today. The men of the 58th knew they were part of something historic. They understood that they were striking the first blows against the Japanese homeland, opening a campaign that would grow to include thousands of aircraft and reshape the course of the war. Many of them would later transfer to the Marianas, continuing the mission they had begun in China, seeing the campaign through to its conclusion in August 1945. For the Japanese people who experienced the B-29 raids, the memories were indelible. The sound of air raid sirens, the drone of aircraft engines overhead, the whistle of falling bombs, the roar of flames, the heat and smoke and terror of the firestorms became part of their life stories. Survivors passed these memories to their children and grandchildren, keeping alive the experiences of that terrible time. In Japan today, memorials and museums preserve the history of the bombing campaign, honoring the dead and teaching new generations about the costs of war. The cities that were destroyed have been rebuilt, often more modern and prosperous than before. Tokyo is now one of the world's great metropolises, with no visible traces of the destruction it suffered in 1945. Yet, the history remains embedded in the collective memory, shaping how Japanese people understand their past and think about their future. The bombing campaign is taught in schools, debated by scholars, and remembered by a diminishing number of survivors who can speak from personal experience about what it was like to live through that time. In the United States, the B-29 campaign is often reduced to the atomic bomb missions, with Enola Gay and Bockscar remembered, while the hundreds of other missions and thousands of other aircraft are forgotten. This is understandable, given the historic significance of the atomic attacks, but it does a disservice to the fuller story. The conventional firebombing campaign was far more destructive overall than the atomic bombs, killing more people and destroying more cities. The crews who flew those missions faced equal dangers and made equal sacrifices. Their story deserves to be told and remembered alongside the more famous atomic missions. Museums across the United States preserve B-29s and tell their stories. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio displays several B-29s, including Bockscar, the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington displays Enola Gay, carefully restored and interpreted in exhibits that attempt to present the complex history of the atomic bomb missions in a balanced way. Other museums and historical sites preserve additional aircraft and artifacts, keeping the history alive for new generations who have no personal memory of World War II. Veterans of the B-29 campaign formed associations after the war, gathering periodically to remember their service and honor fallen comrades. These gatherings became less frequent as the veterans aged and passed away. Today, very few World War II veterans remain alive, and those who do are in their late 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who can speak from personal experience about what it was like to fly a B-29 over Japan, to face the dangers of combat in those aircraft, to make the decisions and take the actions that shaped history. When the last veteran is gone, the living memory will end, and all that will remain are the written records, photographs, artifacts, and the history books. The story of the B-29 and the campaign against Japan raises questions that each generation must answer for itself. When is the use of force justified? What responsibilities do nations have to protect civilians in wartime? How do we balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns? What are the long-term consequences of our actions, and how do we reckon with the harm we cause, even when pursuing what we believe are just goals? These are not abstract questions. They touch on the fundamental issues of how we live together on this planet, how we resolve our conflicts, and what kind of world we want to create. The development of the B-29 represented an enormous investment of resources and effort. $3 billion in 1945 money, equivalent to well over $40 billion today, was spent developing and producing the aircraft. Thousands of the brightest engineers and technicians worked on the project. Factories across America devoted their capacity to B-29 production. All of this was necessary because American leaders believed that defeating Japan required a weapon capable of reaching the Japanese homeland from distant bases and delivering devastating attacks. They were right. The B-29 did what it was designed to do, but the cost was measured not just in dollars, but in lives, both of those who flew the aircraft and those who died beneath them. The question of whether there were alternatives, whether Japan could have been defeated with less destruction and loss of life, will probably never be answered definitively. History does not run controlled experiments. We cannot go back and try different approaches to see what would have happened. We can only study what did happen, try to understand why decisions were made, and learn what lessons we can from the experience. The B-29 campaign teaches us about the power of technology, the nature of modern warfare, the vulnerability of civilian populations, and the terrible choices that leaders face in wartime. It also teaches us about human resilience and the capacity to rebuild after catastrophic destruction. The Japanese people survived the bombing campaign, rebuilt their cities, and created a peaceful and prosperous society. The scars remain, in memory and in the continuing effects of radiation exposure from the atomic bombs, but Japan has transformed itself from a militarist empire that brought war to much of Asia into a democratic nation that has forsworn military aggression. That transformation was partly imposed by the Allied occupation after the war, but it was also embraced by the Japanese people themselves, who had experienced the costs of war firsthand and chose a different path forward. The United States also changed as a result of World War II and the experiences of the B-29 campaign. The nation emerged from the war as a global superpower with unprecedented military capabilities. The decision to develop and use atomic weapons set America on a path that would define much of the next half-century, as Cold War competition with the Soviet Union drove an arms race that produced weapons capable of destroying human civilization. The B-29, which had been designed to win World War II, became the first atomic bomber, the ancestor of a whole family of strategic bombers that would carry nuclear weapons as their primary mission. Looking back more than 80 years later, we can see the B-29 campaign as a turning point in military history. It was the culmination of trends that had been developing since World War I, when aircraft were first used in combat. It demonstrated what air power advocates had been arguing for decades, that control of the air could be decisive, that strategic bombing could destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war. It also revealed the dark side of these capabilities, the potential for aerial warfare to cause massive civilian casualties and unprecedented destruction. The technology has advanced enormously since 1945. Modern bombers fly faster, higher, and farther than the B-29. Precision-guided munitions allow strikes against specific buildings rather than area bombing of entire cities. Stealth technology makes aircraft nearly invisible to radar. Satellite navigation and communications enable coordination of complex operations across vast distances. Yet the fundamental questions raised by the B-29 campaign remain. How do we use military power responsibly? What are the limits of acceptable conduct in war? How do we protect civilians while still achieving military objectives? These questions are as relevant today as they were in 1945, perhaps more so given the increased destructive power of modern weapons. The story of how Japan was reached by B-29 bombers from China and then from the Marianas is ultimately a story about human choices and their consequences. It began with the decision by Japanese leaders to pursue military expansion across Asia and the Pacific, a decision that brought war and suffering to millions of people. It continued with the American decision to develop the B-29 and use it against Japanese cities, a decision that brought the war home to Japanese civilians with terrible force. It ended with the decision to use atomic weapons, a decision that killed hundreds of thousands, but also ended the war and prevented potentially even greater casualties from an invasion. Each of these decisions was made by people who believed they were doing the right thing, protecting their nations, serving their people, and pursuing victory. Each decision had consequences, many of them unforeseen, that shaped the world we live in today. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. We can understand how the choices made in the crucible of war had effects that rippled across decades and generations. We can use that understanding to make better choices in our own time, to find ways to resolve conflicts without the massive destruction and loss of life that characterized World War II. The B-29 Superfortress was a a product of human ingenuity and industrial capability. In itself, it was neither good nor evil. It was a tool that could be used for different purposes. The crews who flew it were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing what they were trained to do, following orders they believed came from legitimate authority in pursuit of what they understood to be a just cause. The people who died beneath its bombs were equally ordinary, going about their lives, trying to survive a war they had not chosen, victims of decisions made by others. The story encompasses all of these perspectives, and to understand it fully, we must try to see it through different eyes, to comprehend the fears and hopes and choices of everyone involved. In the end, the B-29 campaign against Japan succeeded in its immediate objective. It helped force Japan to surrender, ending World War II without an invasion of the home islands. It demonstrated American technological and industrial superiority. It established the United States as the dominant military power in the Pacific. These were the goals of the campaign, and they were achieved. But the campaign also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, destroyed irreplaceable cultural heritage, and introduced atomic weapons into warfare. These consequences must also be reckoned with as part of the full accounting of what the B-29 accomplished and what it cost. The men and women who lived through this period, who served in the military or worked in war production or survived the bombing raids or simply tried to live their lives during those terrible years, are mostly gone now. Their stories survive in books and archives, in museums and memorials, in the memories of their descendants. It is our responsibility to preserve and understand these stories, not to glorify war or to condemn those who fought in it, but to learn from their experiences and to remember what war costs so that we might work harder to prevent it. The B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that Japan believed could never reach their homeland from China, became the instrument of their defeat. From the first raid on Yawata in June 1944 to the atomic bomb missions in August 1945, it proved that geography and distance could no longer protect nations from attack. It changed the nature of warfare and influenced the course of history. Its legacy remains with us today in the weapons we build, the strategies we pursue, and the questions we continue to ask about the use of force in the modern world. Understanding this history, with all its complexity and moral ambiguity, is essential if we are to learn from the past and build a better future.